This is Whitley Strieber, and this is Dreamland. You have reached the edge of the world. Today on Dreamland, we're going to explore something we've explored many times in many different ways, the afterlife. Now, before you decide, oh, I've heard all of that before, you haven't heard this. And I can assure you that that's true because I know this space really, really well. As you know, she is very much still in my life. The last time I had any contact with Anne was indirect yesterday morning through a friend. So I am not a believer. It's a different state. I live in a state of pretty much certainty about this. Now, one of the things I have never found before is what we're going to talk about today, which is a highly finished, very reasoned argument that uses established principles of scientific analysis and investigation to explore the afterlife. We're going to be talking to Chris Carter. He is an Oxford trained philosopher. He's the author of 4 books, and the latest one is The Case for the Afterlife. It's a remarkable book. And Chris knows this stuff in a way that really I've never heard before. So it is my great privilege to welcome Chris Carter to Dreamland. Hello, Chris. Chris is with us in Manitoba, apparently deep in Manitoba from the looks of the image, but we can't improve it. So here we are. His audio is just fine. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Whitley.
Well, it's a pleasure. And what makes this book different is the extraordinarily careful, organized way you go through, the way you go through it. You set out to prove something. Can you tell us, give us a little bit about your motivations? Why did you even get interested in the afterlife, Chris?
Well, it really dates back to my days as a graduate student, and it was a 2-year program, and in another country. And the first year, I was living in a dormitory sort of situation, off campus but near the college. And one night, a friend and I were talking, and he was trying to convince me to join him and 2 other graduate students to spend our second year living in an ancient farmhouse, which was owned by our college, which lay on farmland just outside of town. Well, I wasn't sure if I wanted to move or not because the dorm was much closer to town and college, but he was insistent. And at one point, he basically looked at me and said, "Chris, the place has a ghost." And that sort of froze me in my tracks. And I said, "Well, has anyone seen anything?" He said, "No, but there's been a lot of strange sounds reported." So this intrigued me. I decided to see the place for myself. I ventured out there and I found a medieval 2-story stone farmhouse, quite large, and it seemed nice. The college carpenter had his workshop on the property. So I stopped by to speak with him, and after a brief chat, I just came straight out with it. "I hear the place is haunted." And he said, "Well, I don't know myself, but the carpenter before me, he swore the place was haunted." So that was enough for me. I moved in, spent our second year there, and to make a long story short, I did see and hear some unusual things. When I returned to Canada, I began to reflect on these strange experiences, nothing particularly dramatic, but I began to wonder if any serious research had been done on subjects such as apparitions and communication with the departed. I visited the local library, and I was surprised at the volume of information that there was on this subject. And what really impressed me was the enormous volume of research performed by the British and American Societies for Psychical Research, which were both founded in the 1880s. the British Society was founded in 1882 with Henry Sidgwick, who was a philosopher at Cambridge, as its first president. 2 years later, the American Society was founded with William James as his first president. At the time, he was a philosopher at Harvard University. And the early membership included some of the top, most elite scientists, scholars, physicians, lawyers, and others on both sides of the Atlantic. They coordinate their efforts. And despite the often repeated lie that these men and women found nothing, the simple fact of the matter is by the early years of the 20th century, they had gathered enough convincing evidence to convince virtually all of them of the reality of survival, including those such as the lawyer Richard Hodgson, who started off as diehard skeptics. Hodgson's reason for joining the SPR and conducting investigations was in order to debunk several of the mediums that he investigated. And the SPR did debunk some mediums, mostly professional mediums who accepted money for their services, mostly the so-called physical mediums, the ones who are said to produce physical effects, noises, floating instruments, things like that. But they debunked many of them, and so they turned their attention to what's called mental mediums. And almost without exception, all of the mental mediums that they investigated, and by mental medium I mean somebody who does not produce physical effects, but rather writes on a piece of paper, goes into a trance and writes messages on paper, responds to questions, or in the most dramatic cases, actually the departed person seems to take over their body and vocal cords and speaks directly to the sitters present. Most of these,
I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that most of the mediums studied by the SPR were not professional mediums. They were mostly women of high social standing and high education. They were the wives of politicians, of physicians. One of them was a scholar, a professor of classics at Cambridge. Another one was the first female representative to the League of Nations for Britain. That's the forerunner to the United Nations. So these were not professional mediums, accepted no payment for their services, and most of them insisted on having the reports list them under pseudonyms, so they wouldn't be identified with this until many years later.
Well, I know of physical medium very well, Stuart Alexander, who lives in England, in Hull, and have been in his seance numerous times and actually observed physical effects with my own eyes. So as far as I'm concerned, physical mediumship, which is often debunked, I mean, it's often faked, but in the cases of some physical mediums, it's no fake. But whether or not he's in touch with spirits is another question. He would say he is, and when he turns into, well, I'll give you an example of how powerful this is. He called up my mother one time, and he had never seen my mother and couldn't know anything about her. There's no pictures. You don't find a picture of my mother on the internet, no matter how hard you look. You may find it, but I asked him to. He wasn't, and his face turned into my mother's face. It was appalling. I never saw anything like it in my life. He is able to make spirit trumpets fly around the room and do all kinds of things. Leslie Kean, the author, I think everybody in my audience anyway is familiar with who Leslie is. She's the author of the New York Times story in 2017 that broke the Tic Tac incident, and also a book about the afterlife, and which she's intensely interested in. She's been a friend of Stuart's for years, and she's seen even more powerful conjurings than I have. So that's also real, but that's not really what your book is about. I just feel a need to defend physical mediumship because of what I have seen. I feel a responsibility.
Yeah,
Now,
that's fine. That's fine. I'm not trying. My intention is not to debunk all physical mediums. I mean, we had
yeah,
Daniel Douglas Hume, and there was a fellow in Brazil. I think his name was Mirabelli. They were
yeah,
never debunked, but
no, I know Daniel Douglas Hume could do apparently do levitation. That I, in my book, that my new book, The Fourth Mind, I discussed that extensively because I had a friend who witnessed a levitation. Paul Eno. Paul was a, uh, a novice in a Catholic religious order, and he was delegated to be the assistant of the diocesan exorcist, and they went to exorcise a young woman who was in a mental institution, and in the middle of the exorcism with the exorcist, Paul, another assistant, a psychiatrist, and two I believe assistants from the hospital, and the girl sitting in a wheelchair, she's a 17-year-old girl with schizophrenia and drug addiction. She comes floating up out of the wheelchair right in front of all of them. And this tells me Paul was the exorcist said to Paul, just push her back down. And he said he told me there was a slight electricity in her body that he could feel in his hand as he pushed her down. And he said it was like pushing a balloon down into the chair. And then she just sat there. But what had to have happened, was that this great bag of water and calcium covered with clothing had to have become so light that it was lighter than air. That's remarkable. And that gets me to my first question about your wonderful, fascinating first chapter, the mind-body relationship. Okay, Chris, you've got some fabulous stuff to say there, and I'm not going to. I think uh, uh, the the question is this, and address this. Uh, Posit the mind can't exist outside of the body. What's wrong with that statement?
where can I start?
Just anywhere, because you've got a great chapter on it.
Well, let me answer the question this way, with a little bit of a preamble. I don't want to get too wordy here, but um, you'll notice that in my book, I argue that the case for the afterlife can be proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Not beyond all conceivable doubt, because that's relevant only in the domains of pure logic and pure mathematics, but beyond all reasonable doubt. I also don't use the term, I also don't use the criterion, rather, of preponderance of evidence. What I argue that the problem with preponderance of evidence, that it implies that there's evidence on both sides, that there's evidence for an afterlife and there's evidence against an afterlife. But I think that's ridiculous, because I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that we do not survive the deaths of our bodies. I think there's plenty of evidence that we do and none that we don't. Now, at this point, certain materialists and so-called skeptics will scoff, and they'll say something like, yes, but what about the overwhelming dependence of the mind on the brain? I mean, we know that an injury to the head can cause somebody to go unconscious, or it can cause lasting brain damage, which impairs mental functions. We know that drugs and alcohol can change consciousness and change perception. We know that we don't seem to function as well when we're tired. What about this overwhelming dependence of the mind, overwhelming evidence of the dependence of the mind on the state of the brain? And that the fallacy of that reasoning can be illustrated with listening to music on the radio and smashing the radio's receiver, and then concluding that the radio was producing the music because you no longer hear any music. The problem is, of course, is that the radio is not producing the music, it is transmitting the music. And so I argue in my book, as many others have over the years. William James argued much the same point in the early years of the 20th century, is that I think that the true relationship of the brain to the mind is that of a receiver-transmitter. In other words, the brain works as a sort of two-way receiver-transmitter for the mind, sometimes from body to mind, as in sense perception, other times from mind to body, as in willed action. And it's not necessary to invoke any evidence that can be, which some regard as paranormal, in order to support this claim. Mainstream medical evidence is more than enough to indicate that the true relationship of the brain to the mind is that of a two-way receiver-transmitter, an instrument which enables the mind to interact in two ways with the material world. There's the well-known phenomenon, which is well-known among people who work with the terminally ill, and that's the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. You probably heard this term before. In the last days, hours, minutes before passing over, people with Alzheimer's, dementia, other forms of brain disease will suddenly become lucid. And even after decades of existing as little more than a vegetable, they'll suddenly wake up and begin speaking with the nurse and ask to see friends and relatives. There was a case, which I mentioned in my book, of a woman with a severe Alzheimer's, which had degenerated parts of her brain. And she, for over a decade, she did little more than just stare at the ceiling or babble incoherently. Then one day, she asked the nurse to call her daughter because she wanted to speak with her daughter. So her daughter came over and was astonished to find her awake and speaking normally. They talked about family matters and so forth. And her daughter said it was like talking to somebody who'd been asleep for the past 2 decades. And this is not something that is rare. It's estimated in about 5 to 10% of Alzheimer's patients who are near death, they'll show this terminal lucidity in the final days, hours, or minutes before they pass over. And this phenomenon was also well known to the ancients. Hippocrates wrote about it, Galen, Cicero, and others. They all noted that symptoms of mental impairment began to cease as the end of the person's life grew nearer, and they all interpreted this as thinking that the soul was disengaging from the restrictions of a material brain. Once we bring in other forms, there's other forms of evidence as well from mainstream medicine, such as the placebo effect. Sometimes a placebo is enough to make a person feel better and induce healing. Now, this makes no sense if the brain does not have a real impact on the mind and works independently of them. The mind works independently of the brain, at least sometimes. Then once you bring in the other sorts of evidence that I deal with in my book, like the near-death experience and other forms of evidence, the case is overwhelming that the mind does not ultimately depend upon the brain, and the brain does not produce the mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that, having been out of my body a number of times and completely out, not in sort of a, not in other words, I've been an entity moving around in this world outside of my body. And, I thought to myself the other day, I was reading about a master in India who went out of his body and immediately ascended into the presence of deity. And I thought to myself, I just went into the front yard. and then, and I thought, gee, I would like to ascend into the presence of deity when I'm out of my body. But my out of body experiences some have been very complex and directed. In other words, they're organized by somebody else on the other side who would touch me here in the back of the neck, just at the junction of at the C1 vertebra and the neck, with something that causes an electrical charge, not an unpleasant feeling at all. In fact, it's very nice. It feels lovely. And you can feel like clamps unloosing down your spine. And then you just roll right out of your body just as easy as pie. And it's just remarkable. I've had that happen a couple of times. And so someone else is involved because I'm not like Bob Monroe, whom I knew a little bit at least. And Bob could do this on his own. I can't. My point is only this: uh, out of body, complete consciousness outside of your body is real. How much you know of yourself, I don't know, because once you're out of your body, you no longer know what you don't know, of course, just like you are in your body. So I don't even know if I know my own name outside of my body. I've never asked myself that question. Okay, now I've got a question for you, those of you who don't subscribe. Why are you going to have to listen to these ads? We've got some new ones today, I'm happy to say, so it's a bit different. But also, those of you who are watching on YouTube, you often complain that there are too many ads. But remember, I can't help that. The ads that YouTube puts in are what they put in, and that we can't control it. But you can. How do you do that? By go to unknowncountry.com and subscribe. For $5 a month, you get the pleasure of not only that huge website with all of the stuff that's available on it, but as well the pleasure of watching Dreamland without any interruptions at all. We'll be right back. Who are they? Why are they here? What do they want with us? Why is it all so secret? All of these questions are explored in my new book, Them, in an entirely new way. What do Close Encounter reports tell us about what the visitors want with us? What is the military's experience? And can our memories be trusted? Can anything be trusted? Them answers all of these questions in a totally new way. It's available in hardcover, softcover, as a Kindle, and as an audiobook, read by me. Get them today, and you can get it from the unknowncountry.com store, signed by me. This is Whitley Strieber. Listen to me now from June of 2010 talking to Alan Lammers about an incredible thing that happened to him on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. Here you are in South Sulawesi in the little town in the district of Sandu Batu. What happened? You were told something rather strange.
Well, we were told before we went, like my friends that I worked with with the NGO, they told me that when you pack, because it kind of happened by accident, I went out to buy a raincoat. It rains quite a bit in this part of the world. And so I went out and I bought a yellow raincoat. And my friend said, I'm sorry, you can't take that to Walla Walla. And I said, well, why not? And he says, well, you can't wear that color. So anyways, excuse me. So I thought, okay, well, what colors can I wear? They said, well, you can only wear black or white. You cannot wear any bright colors, no bright green, especially no yellow. And, that's all you should bring. And I said, well, what would happen? And they said, well, people disappear. You will find the rest of that story, and it is brain-bending, in the June 5th edition of Dreamland, June 5, 2010 edition of Dreamland in the unknowncountry.com archive. This archive is one of the richest of its kind in the world, probably is the richest of its kind in the world, filled with extraordinary shows, of which this show is certainly one, this show with Alan Lammers. You will never have heard anything like it
It does what Dreamland is here to do. It opens your mind to the fact that we live inside a hidden reality that we prefer not to acknowledge, but not here. Here on unknowncountry.com, we do acknowledge it. We live in it and we love it. Subscribe today. You can't go wrong. Go to unknowncountry.com right now and get started. We're talking to Chris Carter. His book, Case for the Afterlife. Now, I am obviously not a skeptic here in that I literally live with my wife. I mean, she's not dead. She's actively engaged, and many of you listeners and viewers have had Anne in your life in the form of the avatar she created before she died. I wrote all about this in a book called The Afterlife Revolution, Chris. So they know, my listeners know what I'm talking about. Now, let's talk about some of the evidence that really, let's see, you sent me a list of questions here. Okay, let's see. Well, you know, there's 5 or 6 questions. It's interesting that quite a few of your questions focus on Christians. And so let's talk about that a little bit, since it seems it's obviously something that concerns you. We sometimes hear committed Christians say that the evidence of mediumship cannot be trusted, that it could be the work of satanic spirits. And you write, how would you respond to that? So, Chris, how would you respond to that?
Well, Matthew quotes Jesus as saying, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are of God. So if we think that there's no reason to believe the change called death suddenly transforms bad people to good, then of course I think it's wise to test the spirits. I mean, most people don't realize that there's evidence that the early Christians were involved in what we would call today spirit communication. Tertullian writes of a woman who communicates, or said to have communicated with angels and other spirits. See, I'm just going to find here. And also it has to remember that many of the early members of the British and American Societies for Psychical Research were themselves members of the clergy. There was a Reverend Charles Drayton Thomas. He was a Methodist minister who for many years was active in researching mediums for the British Society. And this is what he wrote. Perhaps it will be asked what benefit may be expected from a general acceptance of this evidence for survival. I think it will do for others what it has done for me. It has supplemented and reinforced my faith, both in times of bereavement and in the prospect of old age and death. Also, it has further emphasized the value of personal religion. There's a Catholic priest that I quote. He talks about how the opinions within the Catholic Church are changing. A Church of England committee thoroughly studied records of mediumship for 2 years. They analyzed data. They sat with one of the leading mediums in England at the time. And they came to this conclusion. There were 10 members, and they said, the hypothesis that the spirit communications proceed in some cases from discarnate spirits is the true one. So I don't believe there's anything in my book which is contrary to original Christian doctrine.
Yeah, and of course, you know, I always think of the fact that there are many other religions in the world, and they all have different attitudes toward this. Christianity is actually one of the few where there are entire denominations that believe any spirit contact is evil. It was with demons. in Africa, there is a really complex situation with regard to this in the old animistic religions. And there's all kinds of stuff, both positive and negative. In the Amazon, mostly it's positive. And in Islam, there are the jinn, and there's all. So but one thing there isn't a religion that says there is no such thing as a spirit world and an afterlife. One of our oldest beliefs is that we are not just physical. You mentioned somewhere in the book about the Neanderthals. Do you recall that? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, I just mentioned that very briefly that the belief in an afterlife dates back at least to the Neanderthals, who buried their dead with flowers and utensils, presumably for use in the next world. And you are absolutely right that mediumship and communication with the departed has been widely reported from virtually all cultures of which we have record. The ancient Chinese describe wizards communicating with the departed. The Maori of New Zealand, several different native North American tribes, African tribes, as you mentioned. All over the world, people have reported this sort of thing for thousands of years.
Well, and the original wizard, of course, was Zoroaster, who, if you look at Fantasia and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the sorcerer is wearing the clothing of Zoroaster, with the conical hat and the star-covered robe, I guess. And there's a whole hidden story behind that episode of Fantasia. Like so many people in the world of the entertainment and the media, Walt Disney knew a lot of things that he didn't discuss directly, but which are reflected in various ways in his work. Now, what is it, do you think, in the mind of the skeptic that makes them literally run after this stuff? They don't just, it's not just saying, well, we need more proof. They will pounce on it like it was something evil. Why is that? Let's take the second break before Chris tackles that question. We'll be right back. Have you ever read Communion? Or have you never read Communion? It's out in a new edition. Very powerful, a subtly new cover that reflects the fact that the visitors are now looking back at us, because they truly are. You can get it from the unknowncountry.com store as a Kindle, as a beautiful, sumptuous paperback, or as an unabridged audiobook read by me. It's the first time in the whole life of Communion that it has been read in full in audio format, and believe you me, I felt that reading. I put my life, my memories into it, and I trust you can hear it in the voice. I sure felt it while I was reading. So get Communion, listen to it, read it. Communion is of central importance to all of our lives. Where is the unknown country? Is it out there in the stars? Or is it also somewhere else? Is it in us, in you? Unknown country, join us today. Go to unknowncountry.com right now and join us Join the questions. Join the search. Join the adventure. UnknownCountry.com. There's no place like it in the world. We're talking to Chris Carter. His book, The Case for the Afterlife. What about the skeptics? Who are they, and why do they say no rather than looking at the evidence? I don't understand that.
The skeptics are a mixed and motley bunch. They come from all walks of life. What they seem to have in common, as you rightfully said, is a hostility towards anything that's not doesn't support their very narrow fundamentalist ideas of science. It's important to remember that most of these dogmatic so-called skeptics are actually militant atheists. And one of the fundamental pillars supporting the atheistic worldview is the ancient doctrine of materialism. And that's the idea that all events have a physical cause and that the mind is produced by the brain. Now, any evidence to the contrary provides a direct challenge to the doctrine of materialism and thus threatens the collapse of this entire worldview. And so this, more than anything else, I believe, explains their dogmatic opposition to the evidence that proves materialism false.
Yeah, I think it does. There's another approach called idealism, which stands in opposition to materialism. That basically that reality starts with idea rather than matter, and I think that there's a good case for idealism, a good scientific case even for idealism. Let's go on.
Whitley, I'd like to say something here. I like the way a physicist named Nick Herbert expressed his opposition to both idealism and materialism. He says materialism can't explain mind, idealism can't explain matter. I'm not an idealist. I'm obviously not a materialist. I would consider myself a dualist, a modern, updated form of dualism. Not exactly Descartes, but something different. So we're really talking about, when we're talking about the mental and the physical, we're talking about two differently described aspects of reality which relate to each other and can affect each other. And Henry Stapp, he is a physicist at Berkeley. He puts forward a convincing case for a new updated form of interactive dualism. The philosopher Karl Popper, considered one of the greatest, probably the greatest philosopher of science the world has ever known, he was a dualist, as was his friend Sir John Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his discovery how neurons in the brain communicate via chemicals he called neurotransmitters. Philosopher Kurt Dukas, Neil Grossman, Robert Almader. Dualism is an ancient and, in my opinion, perfectly respectable viewpoint, which, unlike materialism and unlike idealism, it can accommodate the existence and reality of both matter and mind and account for the interaction between the two.
Let's now talk about mediums and mediums who do. You have a chapter called Display of Skills, which is about mediumship and skills that mediums can acquire from somewhere that they do not actually possess themselves. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, well, that's an important chapter. You've raised an important point here. Some of the less dogmatic skeptics will try to explain away the evidence for survival by saying it's due to some form of extrasensory perception, either between the medium and the sitter, or believing that's been proven false. But I mentioned Reverend Drayton Charles Thomas. He proved that idea false through the invention of proxy sittings. He brought in a third person who did not know the departed. All they knew was their name and the date of their death. They would go as a proxy for the person who was actually interested in speaking to the medium, and the results continued. So even the critics admitted that mediumship could not be explained by simple extrasensory perception between a medium and a sitter. So that after this was proven false, they came up with the untestable theory of super extrasensory perception. That's the idea that the medium possesses vast, virtually unlimited powers of telepathy and clairvoyance, and can read people's minds regardless of what they may happen to be thinking about at the present, or instantly track down books and other written material clairvoyantly. In other words, powers vastly exceeding that found in the laboratory or in other anecdotal reports. And that's not even enough. I argue that that can't explain the best cases, because no amount of perception, mere perception, extrasensory, normal, super or otherwise, can explain the display of skills. What I mean is, there are cases in which the medium seems to instantly acquire the skills that the departed person required years of practice to acquire, and only temporarily, only for as long as the communication lines are open. Speaking foreign languages that the medium never learned, playing chess, discussing philosophy. So it's discussing classical literature. There's simply no amount of any form of perception can possibly account for the display of skills.
Well, you talk about a mid-19th century situation, Judge Edmonds, whose daughter Laura began to be able to speak in many different languages. And she could speak in 9 or 10 languages for hours at a time.
Mm-hmm.
This is remarkable. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case?
Well, it's not a single case. It's a collection of cases which there was Judge John Worth Edmonds. He was president of the New York State Senate and justice of the Supreme Court of New York. And in 1855, he reported a case involving his daughter Laura. Now, the judge began investigating mediums in order to debunk them. He was hostile. So you can imagine his dismay when his daughter Laura began displaying skills as a medium. And one of her most impressive gifts was, as you said, the ability to speak in different languages. This is what Edmonds wrote. She knows no language but her own and a little smattering of boarding school French. Yet she has spoken in 9 or 10 different tongues, sometimes for an hour at a time, with the ease and fluency of a native. It is not infrequent that foreigners converse with their spirit friends through her in their own language. A recent instance occurred where a Greek gentleman had several interviews and for several hours at a time carried on the conversation on his part in Greek and received his answers sometimes in that language and sometimes in English. Yet until then, she had never heard a word of modern Greek spoken. And that was a remarkable case. Essentially, a Greek fellow named Evangelides, who Edmonds had never met before, visited their home for a seance with Edmonds' daughter. And they spoke in Greek. And at one point, for some reason, Evangelides began to weep. And nobody knew why, and he wouldn't talk about it. Well, at another seance held shortly afterwards, Evangelides explained why he began to weep. That's because his daughter Laura, Edmonds' daughter Laura, had told him that his son had died recently in Greece. As far as Evangelides knew, his son was in perfect health. But several days later, a letter came informing Evangelides that his son had died. So this is what Edmonds wrote about this. To deny the fact is impossible. It was too well known. I could as well deny the light of the sun, nor could I think it an illusion, for it is no way different from any other reality. It took place before 10 educated and intelligent persons. We had never seen Mr. Evangelides before. He was introduced by a friend that same evening. How could Laura tell him of his son? How could she understand and speak Greek, which she had never previously heard?
Isn't that incredible? I find it completely incredible. I guess it's because I'm so bad at other languages. I just recently came back from France, where they were surprisingly polite. The French were, when you at least when you try to speak their language, they are helpful. Otherwise, if you just ignore their language and speak English, they're not so helpful. But when you try French, um, it works pretty well. I mean, people even in the street will help you. Anyway, I'm no good at languages. I've been trying to learn French for years and years. So I'm very impressed with this story. The idea of being able to spout out Greek or French or any language, 10 languages at just like that. I wonder, it doesn't say much about her in the book. You probably don't have any idea of how she felt about this, or do you? No, I don't think that was recorded.
No.
And what happened to her in life as she uh, passed along in life, you just don't know what, it's a long time ago now, and it's been lost in the mists of time.
Well,
Now,
the importance of these cases, and this is not the only case where the medium has instantly and temporarily acquired the skill the deceased person required years of practice to acquire. The importance of these cases is that it proves false the idea that some form of super extrasensory perception or living agent extrasensory perception can explain the very best cases, because no amount of perception, normal, extrasensory, super, otherwise, can explain somebody instantly acquiring skills which normally require years, if not decades, of practice to acquire. Speaking a foreign language, playing chess, discussing philosophy at a high level, and so on.
it's just remarkable. There's one case in here that just blew my mind. Tell us about the chess game with the non-physical chess master.
Yeah, that's a famous story. That was a chess game that was set up between living and deceased chess grandmasters. That was started by Dr. Wolfgang Eisenbeis. He wanted to initiate a chess match between living and deceased masters. And he contacted Robert Rollins. He was a Romanian-born musician and amateur medium. He never accepted payments for his services. And he had an impeccable reputation for honesty, and Eisenbeis trusted Rollins' assertion that he knew nothing about chess. Eisenbeis was also able to persuade Viktor Korchnoi, he was then ranked third in the world, to participate. And Korchnoi was described in ChessBase as unquestionably one of the great chess players of all time. So Eisenbeis gave Rollins a list of chess grandmasters, asked him to find one who'd be willing to play Korchnoi, and a message apparently from Geza Maraksi came through, who offered to play. And he was ranked third in the world in 1900, so almost a century before. And he agreed to play. He said, "I will be at your disposal in this peculiar game of chess for two reasons." He said he wants to, first, because I also want to do something to aid mankind living on Earth, to become convinced that death does not end everything, but instead the mind is separated from the physical body and comes up to us in a new world where individual life continues to manifest itself in a new unknown dimension. And then he added, second, being a Hungarian patriot, I want to guide the eyes of the world into the direction of my beloved Hungary. Both of these items have convinced me to participate in your game with the thought of being at everyone's service. And anyway, the chess game went on with Rollins acting as an intermediary between Korchnoi and what seems to have been the departed Maraksi. And at the 27th move, this is how Korchnoi, then ranked third in the world, commented on the quality of his opponent's play. He said, during the opening phase, Maraksi showed weakness. His play is old-fashioned, but I must confess that my last moves have not been too convincing. I am not sure I will win. He has compensated the faults of the opening by a strong endgame. In the endgame, the ability of a player shows up, and my opponent plays very well. So anyway, the game went on. It lasted, lasted 52 moves before Maraksi resigned at move 48. In the book, I have a record of the chess game for those who are interested. I have all the moves.
Yeah.
And anyway, there was Bobby Fischer commented on this game. The physicist Russell Targ talked about how he sent the score, which is in my book, to Fischer. And this is what Russell Targ wrote. I sent the reported final chess score to Bobby Fischer, who, as I mentioned earlier, lived in Iceland, having been rescued from a Japanese jail by the kindness of the Icelandic government. Bobby wrote back to me saying that anyone who can go 52 moves with Viktor Korchnoi is playing at a grandmaster level.
Fascinating. It's just remarkable. I mean, we're talking about impossible things, just as if they were real. And the reason is they are. A young woman who can speak languages she's never even heard, a chess master from the beyond. These are quite incredible things. And, it gets me to the larger question of what is this barrier between the living and the dead? After my wife died, she went through a very methodical process of proving to me that she was still here. And she did that by communicating first with friends rather than with me and getting them to call me. So it was pretty convincing. But one of the first things, once we had established communication, she said was, it looks like you're all intentionally ignoring us. And I've learned they see us. They are right here. This world is probably more populated with spirits than it is with physical beings. Why are we like this? Do you have any idea, Chris? Any thoughts?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Whitley.
Well, the question is, why don't we, what's this barrier between us and the dead? Because we can penetrate it so readily. But in our daily lives, most of us just dismiss them and we forget them. Somebody dies and you're grief stricken for 3 years and then you forget it. We don't interact with our dead very consciously very often. And we almost have to have special people like mediums to do it. And I just wonder what's wrong. Something seems wrong.
Well, I think that human beings have always needed intermediaries, what we'd today call mediums, what others would call witch doctors or shamans, to special people to serve as intermediaries between their tribe or their civilization and the spirit world. I don't think that everybody has the gift, at least not in equal proportions. I think that a problem with modern society is that we are in a sort of death denial mode. I don't mean that we deny the evidence. I mean, many of us simply do not want to talk about this for whatever reason. And so,
why not? I mean, it's just so strange.
Yes, it's a natural part of life, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And the sad thing is, because they don't deal with it in more mundane moments, when death does come to them, whether it's a death of a spouse, a parent, a relative, a friend, a child, then all of a sudden they're forced to think about it. And they, like you say, they grieve for weeks, months, years on end. If the lessons of my book and other similar books, yourself as well, are taken to heart, then everything changes. And we no longer grieve the passing of friends and relatives any more than we grieve when they go on vacation.
Yeah. Well, at first I was of course, in appalling grief over Anne, and I miss her physically. I miss her body. I miss holding her. I miss her voice. I miss all of that. But I don't have the grief of loss anymore. It's more missing the physical part of my wife. The grief of loss it disappeared in the first few months after it became not only obvious that she had come back, but that she had been planning her afterlife for nearly a year before she died. It was just incredible. But, as I say, my listeners all know this story, folks. And if you don't know it, there's a book out there called Afterlife Revolution that Ann and I wrote together after she died. And you can look at that. Now, let's talk about afterlife and reincarnation. You've got some very interesting things to say about Ian Stevenson and the whole idea of reincarnation in the afterlife and afterlife survival.
Yeah, well, why don't we circle back to something we discussed earlier, and that's the relationship between this evidence and modern Christianity. Because I think that the line of evidence that's most troubling to modern Christians would be the idea of reincarnation for a number of reasons. But several theologian philosophers have argued that there's nothing incompatible about reincarnation with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Robert Almeida is a philosopher. He's concluded, these are his words, he's concluded that there are sound scriptural, traditional, and philosophical reasons for Christians to endorse the belief in reincarnation. And he wrote, there is nothing inconsistent with believing in the core doctrines of Christianity and simultaneously believing in some sort of reincarnation. It's important to remember that many of the early Christians themselves believed in reincarnation. It seems to have been just standard practice, not only among Christians, but among pagans as well, until the Council of, there was a council that was the Council of Constantinople in 553 AD, and seems to have been politically motivated. And the Pope did not call the council, he did not endorse it, he did not attend. And yet, for some reason, many people today, especially Catholics, seem to think there's some sort of papal ban on reincarnation. As far as I know, there's none.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've gone down that same path, and I agree with you. There really isn't any, but boy, I mean, I've talked to many priests who will debunk reincarnation because they believe that that's the church's position. And yet, do you have past life memories?
No, past life memories usually fade by the time, they're usually found in children as soon as a child can speak. They usually fade by the age of 9 or 10. I do not have any past life memories. As far as I know, I never had any past life memories. But I just want to keep going on that topic because many theologians are arguing, that Christians should take a second look, modern Christians. There's a theologian, Geddes McGregor, he wrote, reincarnation takes care of the problem of moral injustice. To the age-old question of Job, why do the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? The reincarnationist has a ready answer. We are seeing in this life only a fragment of a long story. Death is but the end of a chapter. It is not the end of the story.
One of the things that happens, I've been at my age at more than one deathbed, people they change. Like my wife became telepathic in the last couple of days of her life. And another friend, Bernie Herwood, I was actually at the Monroe Institute when he was lay dying in New York City. And instead of being at his bedside, and it was just as well because he showed up. I could see him clearly, and no one else could see him, but I could see him very clearly sitting beside me, listening to Bob talk about the various levels of the afterlife. And Bernie was very interested. So, we tell ourselves we live in a world which is just this, but we don't. We live in another reality that we don't acknowledge fully and completely. One of the reasons is that the whole nature of science, we talk about the scientific method, but you can't apply it to this for a simple reason. The scientific method requires evidence that you can detect, and we don't have a means of detecting this evidence. there was electronic voice phenomena. I don't think I read anything about that in your book. I'm not. No. Well, that seemed to be evidentiary, but it's not something that really works anymore. Strangely enough, it stopped working after a while. And you can't really do it very successfully anymore. But is there any possibility, do you think, that we could ever learn how to detect the spirit world in some objective way, the same way we can pick up radio waves, for example? Is there anyone working on that?
I think that we already have. I'm not talking about electronic voice phenomenon. I'm talking about mental mediumship. I mean, part of the reason why the SPR stopped studying physical mediums is because the accusation of fraud or misperception or mistaken eyewitness identity, mistaken eyewitness testimony can be just too easily invoked. With mental mediumship, it was standard SPR policy to have everything the medium said or wrote recorded. And so we have the permanent and objective record of the communications, which can be examined by anyone at any time, and they're not going to change, and they do not depend upon eyewitness testimony. You mentioned something about science requires evidence. Well, different sciences gather evidence in different ways. Some look through telescopes, some look through microscopes, some go out in the field and do studies of animal behavior and what have you in the fields. Others study the geological record. So there isn't just one method of gathering evidence in science. And my book is not about, it's about, I present 5 independent lines of evidence: deathbed visions, near-death experience, apparitions, evidence of previous lives or memories of previous lives, and communication via human mediums from the departed. And these 5 lines of evidence, all very different from each other, all point in the same direction. And in terms of scientific method, science is really about proving hypotheses false. And I argue in my book that the case for the afterlife has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt, because the alternative hypotheses of fraud, mistaken eyewitness testimony, incompetence, and finally, super extrasensory perception or living agent extrasensory perception. I argue that all of these counter explanations have been proven false. So it's not that I've proven this beyond all conceivable doubt, but I think that the case has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt.
Beyond all reasonable doubt. Chris Carter, Case for the Afterlife. I think you've made a fascinating case, and it's been quite an interesting journey today, Chris. I'd like to thank you very much for being with us on Dreamland. I'm glad we got the show started. At first, it looked like we wouldn't be able to because of interference. I mean, not psychic interference, just internet issues, I hope. But we did a good job, and I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I hope you did too, folks. Stay with Dreamland. We've got a lot of exciting stuff coming up. There is major stuff going on in the UAP NHI world, and we're going to be right on top of it. So stay with Dreamland. The show's been around for a long time, and it's one place where I think we know what we're doing. Thank you very much for being with us, Chris, and Dreamlanders, thank you so much for supporting this wonderful, lovely show that is so much a part of my life.
Thank you, Whitley.
Thank you for listening. Dreamland is brought to you by Unknown Country and its family of subscribers. Our news editor is Matthew Frizzell. Our site coordinator is Amy Safrankova. The founder of UnknownCountry.com is Ann Strieber. I'm Whitley Strieber, your host for Dreamland.